Hello all, welcome to my channel. Today's topic for discussion is a poem. The name of the poem is Home Burial, written by Robert Frost. Moving on to the poem. The poem presents a few moments of charged dialogue in a strained relationship between a rural husband and wife who have lost a child. The woman is distraught after catching sight of the child's grave through the window, and more so when her husband doesn't immediately recognize the cause of her distress. She tries to leave the house, the importunes her to stay for once and share her grief with him to give him a chance. He doesn't understand what it is he does that offends her or why she should grieve outwardly so long. She resents him deeply for his composure, what she sees as his hard-heartedness. She vents some of her anger and frustration and he receives it. But the distance between them remains. She opens the door to leave as he calls after her. The form of the poem. This is actually a dramatic lyric. Dramatic in the sense that, like traditional drama, it presents a continuous scene and employs primarily dialogue rather than narrative or narration or description. It is dramatic too in its subject matter. Dramatic in the sense of emotional or emotional sense. Form fits content well in this poem. One can easily imagine two actors on stage portraying this brief, charged scene. Rhythmically, Frost approaches pure speech and some lines taken out of context sound as prosaic as anything. For example, line 62, I do think though you overdo it a little. Generally, there are 5 stressed syllables per line, although they are not always easy to scan with certainty. Stanza breaks occur where quoted speech ends or begins. See the tone, vocabulary, and phrasing of the dialogue. It is also very interesting. At the time of Home Burial's publication, it represented a truly new poetic genre, an extended dramatic exercise in the natural speech rhythms of a region's people from the mouths of common yet vivid characters. Home Burial is one of Rose's most outwardly sad poems. There are at least 2 tragedies here: the death of a child, which antecedes the poem, and the collapse of a marriage, which the poem foreshadows. Home Burial is about grief and grieving, but most of all, it seems to be about the breakdown and limits of communication. The husband and the wife represent 2 very different ways of grieving. The wife's grief infuses every part of her and does not wane with time. She has been compared to a female character in Prose, A Mask of Mercy, of whom another character says she has had some loss she can't accept from God. The wife remarks that most people make only pretense of following a loved one to the grave, when in truth their minds are making the best of their way back to life and living people and things they understand. She, however, will not accept this kind of grief, will not return from the grave back to the world of living, for to do so is to accept the death. Instead, she declares that the world's evil. The husband, on the other hand, has accepted the death. Time has passed, and he might be more likely now to see that's the way of the world than the world's evil. He did grieve, but the outward indications of his grief were quite different from those of his wife. He threw himself into the horrible task of digging his child's grave, into physical work. This action further associates the father with a way of the world mentality, with the cycles that make up the farmer's life, and with an organic view of life and death. The father did not leave the task of burial to someone else. Instead, he physically dug into the earth and planted his child's body in the soil. One might say that any form of grief in which the bereaved stubbornly finds the world evil is not a very healthy one. One could also claim that the bereaved who never talks through his grief, who never speaks of it, is doing himself and others injury. But again, the purpose of the poem isn't really to determine the right way to grieve. Rather, it intends to portray a failure of empathy and communication. Each person fails to appreciate the other's grieving process, fails to credit it, allow it, and have patience with it, and each fails to alter even slightly his or her own form of grief in order to accommodate the other. Note how utterly the women understand the man's actions. To her, the act of burying the child was one of supreme indifference, while to him it must have been one of supreme suffering, an attempt to convince himself through physical labor. And this is a natural order of things, or an act of self punishment, a penance befitting the horror of the loss, or a simple way of steeping himself in his grief, of forcing it into the muscles of his arms and back, of feeling it in the dirt on his clothes. Note to how the wife completely fails to grasp the meaning of her husband's words. 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day will rot the best birch fence a man can build. Indisposed to see her husband's form of grieving as acceptable, she takes his words as literal, inappropriate comments on fence building. Yet, they have everything to do with the little body in the darkened parlor. He is talking about death, about the futility of human effort, about fortune and misfortune, about the unfairness of fate and nature. And yet, the man is also partially to blame. If he had any understanding of how to communicate to her, he would not leave everything unspoken. He would make some concession to her needs and articulate a brief defense. You misunderstand, he might say. When I said that, it was because that was the only way I knew anything at all about our laws. Instead, he lets her accusations float in the air as if they were just hysteria and nonsense and not worth challenging. This displays a lack of empathy and a failure of communication as fatal as hers. When she describes his artless act of grave digging, he says only, I shall laugh the worst laugh I ever laughed, or I am cursed. God, if I don't believe, I am cursed. This leaves her free to believe that he accepts her accusation that the curse refers to her, his hard-heartedness, and not the terrible irony of her misinterpretation. He uses irony where she requires clarity. She needs him to admit to agony, and he can grant her no more than veiled reference to a substratum of unspoken grief. And in the face of a grief's obvious persistence, he makes a callous or at very least extremely counterproductive remark. I do think, though you overdo it a little. How important a role does gender play in this tragedy? Certainly, it has some relevance. There are the husband's futile, abortive physical threats as if he could physically coerce her into sharing her grief, but these are impulses of desperation. And both husband and wife acknowledge that there are separate spheres of being and understanding. Can't a man speak of his own child? He is lost. Ask the husband. I don't know rightly whether any man can. She replies. A little later he laments. A man must partly give up being a man with women folk. He sees his and he seeks his inability to say the appropriate thing as a masculine trait, and she seems to agree. Additionally, it is fairly standard to assume that more outward emotion is permitted of women than of men. The tragedy of this poem might then be seen as an exacerbation of a persuasive inequality. Yet one enduring stereotype of gender distinctions is a man's inability to read between the lines, his failure to apprehend the emotions underlying the literal meaning of women's words. In this poem, husband and wife fail equally in this manner. A woman perhaps might be less likely to dig a grave to vent her grief, but she is just as likely to react to death by withdrawal or by immersion in a different task. The reader witnesses the breakdown of a marriage, but more basically, this is a breakdown of human communication. Partly that breakdown is due to the inescapable limits of any communication. Much of the literature of the 20th century stems from an acknowledgement of these limits, from attempts to grapple with them and paradoxically expresses them. A great deal of prose poetry deals with an essential loneliness which is linked to the limits of empathy and the sense that some things are simply inexpressible. What can one really say about the loss of one's child? Can one adequately convey one's grief on such an occasion? Its empathy is always a challenge, doomed to fail under such particular strain. So that's all about the